Hi, my name is Jennifer Selesky. I work at the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I have a question about the social impact bonds and those kind of mechanisms. If I'm working in an issue area where I think something like a social impact bond would be a good approach, what would be the first step I would need to take to put that process in place?
I would quickly answer that it's far from a silver bullet and far from a panacea for a lot of our social challenges, but what we found is that it's worked in several issue areas like homelessness, like workforce development, like early childhood education, like health. And you need to have several ingredients in there. The ROI needs to work, the math needs to work. You got to have the data to prove that the math works, and it needs to be in an issue area where you actually have I would put this in quotes, especially after Rahn's talk, that there's sufficient evidence and track record that the intervention could produce results, because it would be very hard to attract investment capital without that track record.
So you need evidence of the cost effectiveness of the approach.
Cost effectiveness is very much part of the math.
And if I would add one additional component that seems to be present wherever there has been a successful pay for success or social impact bond partnership, it's leadership. What we're talking about is fundamentally changing the status quo, whatever that status quo is in your community. And that leadership can come from a high quality evidence-based nonprofit. It can come from civic leaders. It could come from public officials. It could come from impact investors. It can come from a lot of places. But I think you have to have somebody who really wants to own this and make this happen, because if you don't have somebody pushing every day to make one of these projects come together, it's very, very difficult to pull them off.
Hi, my name is Douglas Cook from Advisory Affiliates. And Tracy, I was just wondering if, or anyone in the panel, knows of anyone in the local area in terms of social impact bonds or so forth who's been involved in the social impact pay for performance Partnership Act, the federal act that was passed, $100,000. I don't know.
I would love to take that. I wanted to mention it in my talk, but Ian kicked me off the stage. So, we don't lobby, but we have been educating folks on the Hill and the prior administration. We spent a lot of time in Washington running around since 2013, helping to shape a bill at the federal level to encourage pay for success. And it's been a long journey, and we came so close so many times, and it was proposed at a peak of $300 million being a fund, House, and Treasury. And in the most uncanniest of times, that bill was passed earlier this year, in February of this year, and got signed into law by the president. It will authorize $100 million of federal dollars to be House and Treasury to provide matching outcomes payments to state and local government. And there's also a bucket for evaluation and administrative costs as well.
Hi, my name is Carol McAvey. I am a Sparrow Incorporation. You mentioned beyond the impact bond, and you said the career bond, and then you mentioned two others. Could you just, in a brief synopsis, sum it up, and if one is more important than the other?
I think, maybe I'll take a brief stab at that. I don't know that any one of these tools, and there are many of them, and many of them are in the book, and I'd encourage you to flip through it. The book is free, so I'm not trying to sell you books. Yes, the field is moving incredibly fast, and people are iterating on this basic concept in many different ways. And I would say, just to be sort of brief about it, it's all about trade-offs. So if you have an RCT, as Ron mentioned, there are upsides to that, and there are downsides to that, if that's built into the evaluation framework for a pay-for-success contract of some kind. Maybe you don't want to incur the cost of an RCT or the complexity of an RCT. Well, that's fine, but then you won't have the level of statistical significance associated with the outcome. So it's cheaper, but maybe you have a little bit less proof that whatever the outcome was actually achieved. And I think you could look at each one of these pay-for-performance tools, and you could sort of identify strengths and weaknesses of all of them, and it's going to come down to the individual community and the capacity that they have, which one they choose. And the nice thing is they have a pretty big menu, pretty long menu to choose from now, and that wasn't the case only a few years ago when the social impact bond was really the only tool on the scene.
Can I add something to that? For most people in not-for-profits, and I appreciated what you just said, these are pretty complicated, and it requires a lot of data and a lot of evidence, and a lot of folks are not going to be anywhere close to that in terms of thinking you're going to walk out of here and leap into something like that as a viable solution. Not that it couldn't be long-term, but what I would say, we didn't have time to talk about this, but when you think about social enterprise, when we talked about what the problem was, I didn't have time to talk about some of the solutions that we've deployed. We have for-profit partnerships, large-scale for-profit partnerships now. We have a large-scale social enterprise. We actually have 2 of them running, and we're working on a 3rd one now. And we have another situation we're working on where we're engaging employers. Because with employment being the way that it is, employers are pretty incented to think about how do they leverage organizations like ours to create solutions. So does healthcare. So when you're thinking about what tools are in your toolkit, while social impact bonds are wonderful and there's some really neat tools there, I wouldn't use that as the only one. There's quite a few others that you might consider.
And I'll just add one quick thing. We in the city of Boston, and I'm speaking about the government, the local government, have not really figured out yet how to leverage.
You and the vets deal, Ron.
Well, which is fairly recent, but Tracy and I probably see each other 2 or 3 times a year trying to figure out, what's a compelling deal. And especially in education, I think it's been difficult to find proximate outcomes that we think are meaningful for investors, but that also give us some glimpse into meaningful results for young people. We did actually it was with Third Sector Capital, feasibility study around high school performance, and it just kind of collapsed under its own weight trying to find the outcome. And Tracy mentioned early learning. I know that Utah in particular, and maybe Chicago, is looking at the diversion from special needs in early elementary grades is kind of the proof point of the effectiveness of early learning. But that's a dangerous one. I mean, that's one way to think about it, but you also want to make sure that young people who need the kinds of supports that come with special needs services get them, and that you don't have a perverse incentive to divert young people from programs that they need.
So we only have a couple more minutes here. Sorry, is there another question?
Hi, I'm Ann Hayes. I'm at Trinity Boston Foundation. And Angela, I was just wondering, because you had said earlier that you see a funding gap in that middle ground before people fail, and I'm wondering if you see a role for social impact bonds or any of those in that area to help fund that, as opposed to going in the direction of this government and charity that you talked about.
So it's an interesting question, and we've looked at social impact bonds a couple of times, but candidly we've come back to 3 primary funding sources or primary interested parties. When you're thinking about creating a value proposition, we've thought about who are we creating it for primarily when we fix stuff like this, or when you move upstream and you deal with an issue before it turns into hospitalization or before it turns into failure out of work or something like that. Government is one of them, so certainly government as partner will continue to be partner, but as you note, and you noted, and somebody earlier did too, it's really a quagmire to try to get that, because often the benefits are in another department or another area, and so we've had a really hard time getting that to come together so that one department will pay for another department's gains. But the other 2 that are viable is healthcare and employers. Those are our 2 big ones where we're avoiding healthcare costs, long-term healthcare costs. We've been working on healthcare partnerships with healthcare insurers and others to try to prove that the interventions that we're doing have a direct line to social determinants of health and into long-term healthcare cost. That's a longer path. The shorter one is on the employment side that I referred to earlier. But the way we've been able to bridge through that is creating social enterprise. So we've actually figured out what things do we know how to do that actually create value further upstream that somebody could pay for, and using the profitability. I'll give you a specific example. We have a company called Language Bank, So we do resettlement of refugees and immigrants, and in that, we happen to know culture and language extremely well. So we decided to use that, train people to be interpreters and translators, and sell that service to hospitals and court systems, which we do in huge scale, and use the profits from that to fund some of this gap that we're talking about. So we've had to take a bunch of different approaches to get at it, but eventually it would be kind of neat to think that we'd make it over into the social impact space. But one of the troubles with social impact bonds is the risk that sits also with the providers. It's one of the reasons we haven't done it, because cash flow is everything, and so, and figuring out where you get your capital from. So I think there's challenges there that it's gotten better over the past couple of years than it was when it first came out. But for us, we're looking for more sustainable, not temporary funding. Hence the reason we're into social impact and social enterprise and other funds.
I just want to clarify that last point, which is important. From the perspective of the provider, virtually all the deals in the world, there's actually no financial participation by the nonprofit service provider, i.e.
You don't put money in.
You actually, the private investors are providing all the funding to the nonprofit. It comes in just like a grant. It's multi-year, it's term capital, it's full cost recovery, which is very different from philanthropy or government funding. It still sunsets at some point, and you still have to deal with the cliff and the out years, but it's actually grant capital to the nonprofits.
Now, there is substantial reputational risk,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, these are high-profile deals. You end up getting written about in the New York Times, and when it doesn't work, that could be a scarlet letter of failure that would make it very difficult for you to go back to a grant funding request funding model. We are out of time, but 1 second before I get the hook from Jen here. In 10 seconds or less, we talk about what matters, we talk about success. Who gets to decide what matters?
People not in this room.
Well, ideally, who would make that determination?
The client.
So just really quickly, in 10 seconds.
To me, it has to be the client. It has to be the people we're serving that define their own success, and we have to learn how to define ours based on theirs.
Ron?
I agree. Politically, capital determines, though. We need to find a way to counteract that.
Okay.
And shout out to Ben Franklin. I told him I would shout them out.
Bring them into this room.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. You guys are awesome. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your presentations.